Okay, so here we're back with the second video. I'm going to show you how to complete the square. So first I'm going to show you what completing the square is. Then I'll show you how to use it to solve a quadratic equation. So the goal is to get this last number to be a perfect square number as we saw in the previous video. So it doesn't matter what A is, what B is, we want C to be a perfect square number. So we need to figure out what this number must be in order to be a perfect square number. That way when I factor it, it'll factor into the same number twice, like x minus 6 times x minus 6, or x plus 5 times x plus 5. So there's two steps. Step 1, take half the middle number. And then step 2, after you take half the middle number, square that number. Okay, so I'm gonna use these two steps to go through and find C here and C here. So if I take half of this number, half of 10 is 5. So that is step 1. Take half of the middle number. Step 2, square that number. So I'm going to take this number and square it. Mental math or calculator, that means to do 5 times 5, 25. So 25 is the answer for this. Take half the middle number, 10 divided by 2 is 5, half the middle number, and square that number. You should get 25. I'll do the same thing over here. We're going to take half of this number. It's okay to get a fraction, so there's nothing wrong with a fraction. So if I take half of this number, we got 5 halves. So half of 5, 5 divided by 2 is 5 halves. Yes, you can give it to me as 2.5, but it's not going to benefit you when we get ready to solve using completing the square. So go ahead and leave it as an improper fraction. And step 2, square this number. Calculator, mental math, whatever floats your boat. 5 halves squared is 25 fourths. So 25 fourths would be the number that I substitute into here to make it be a perfect square number. And and then 25 would be the number that I substitute in here to make it be a perfect square number. Now that we know how to complete the square, I'm going to show you how to use completing the square to solve a quadratic equation. So the two steps that we're adding on to our knowledge that we have here, we're going to take half the middle number and then square. Half the middle number, square. So let's rock and roll. All right, so here's our first problem. X squared minus 10x plus 24. As you can see, this number here is not a perfect square number. I can't do 2 times 2, 3 times 3, 4 times 4, 5 times 5. Yes, I can multiply it, but it'll give me 2 different numbers. So this number is not a perfect square number. So what do we need to do? We need to move it over to the other side because it's kind of like in the way, so to speak, so I need to move it over. So if I move it over, that's going to give me x squared minus 10x equals negative 24. So it was positive 24 over here. I did a step in my head. Opposite of a positive 24 is to subtract 24 from both sides. So now I have x squared minus 10x equals negative 24. Now I'm going to leave a little space in here, and you'll see what I mean in just a minute. I'm going to leave a little space. I'm trying to add a number purposely so that this number is a perfect square number. So I'm trying to add it purposely so that when I factor, it'll factor easily. Off to the side, I strongly encourage you to actually write out your 2 steps for completing the square. So step 1, take half of this number. Half of negative 10 is negative 5. Now square that number. Negative 5 times negative 5 is 25. So negative 5 is going to be 25 is going to be the number that I add on both sides. So we're going to add 25 here, and we're going to add 25 here. Now, think about why we have to add 25 to both sides. So I'll give you a minute to think about that. Either pause the video, but kind of really think about why we need to add 25 to both sides. And I'll come back and answer that in just a minute. But I'm going to keep solving the problem. Now this problem is just like the square root property problems that we did in the previous video. So I can factor this. It's going to factor into the same thing because it's a perfect square number. So x minus 5, x minus 5. Negative 24 plus 25 is 1. Condense it. It's got the same factor twice. The opposite of squaring something is to take the square root. X minus 5 equals plus or minus 1. So x minus 5 equals plus or minus 1. The square root of 1 is 1. So the square root of 1 is 1. And don't forget to do your plus or minus. I need to set up my two different answers. So it equals positive 1 and it equals negative 1. I can go through and solve these. Add 5, add 5, I got 6. Add 5, add 5, I got 4. So these are our two answers. Now let me go back, recap this problem, add some words and stuff to it. So this 24 was not a perfect square number. So we had to move it over to the other side. So this plus 24, I moved it over. We subtracted 24 from both sides because that's the opposite. Now the stuff in the blue is the new piece, the completing the square part. Take half of the middle number. Half of negative 10 is negative 5 squared. Negative 5 times negative 5 is 25. We added 25 to both sides. So here's that question that I asked you about. We added 25 to both sides because your golden rule when you solve an equation is what you do to one side, you have to do to the other side. So I can't just add 25 here because then it's lopsided. So I added 25 here, added 25 there. From here, I went through, solved the equation. Opposite of squaring is to take the square root, plus or minus 1. We did 5 plus 1 and 5 minus 1, and we got our two answers. Okay, number 2. All right, we're going to go through that same thing again. This number here is not a perfect square number. So I need to move it out of the way and purposely make it be a perfect square number. So that's going to give me x squared plus 4x, leave a little space, equals 12. So it was negative on the left-hand side. Opposite of a negative is to add 12 to both sides. That's where I got this 12 from. Off to the side, I strongly encourage you, and you'll see why in just a minute, to write out your two steps. Half of 4 is 2, and 2 times 2 is 4. So half of 4 is 2, and 2 times 2 is 4. So 4 is going to be the number that I'm going to add to both sides to keep my equation balanced. Because what you do to one side, you got to do to the other side. So I added 4 here, and we added 4 over here. Because we got to keep our equation balanced. From here, we're going to factor this. It's going to factor into the same thing twice. That's the beautiful thing about perfect square numbers. It's going to factor into the same number twice. And 12 plus 4 is 16. I can go ahead and condense this. And you might already be in that habit since this is, we've done a few of these in the past couple of videos. You probably can just go ahead and condense it. But if not, it's fine. Write it out twice. The opposite of squaring something is to take the square root. So x plus 2 equals, the square root of 16 is plus or minus 4. Then we got two different answers. So I'm going to set up my two different equations to solve. Okay. So x plus 2 equals positive 4. X plus 2 equals negative 4. So I set up two different equations so I can get my two different answers. Over here, subtract 2, subtract 2. Over here, subtract 2, subtract 2. So our two answers are positive 2 and negative 6. And we are going to look at one more. So if you notice, the pattern is the same. So math is all about figuring out the pattern. You want to take a look at this C number. see if it's a perfect square number. 24 and negative 12, see if those numbers are a perfect square number. Most of the time, it probably will not be a perfect square number, so you want to move it over to the other side and complete the square. Complete the square, you take half the middle number and square. All right, last one I want to look at. The first two that we've done, the coefficient has been 1. So this is 1x squared, and this is 1x squared. Let's take a look at what happens if I have any other number besides 1. So these both coefficients are 1. Let's see what happens if my coefficient is not 1, as in number 3. So number 3, 3x squared plus 10x minus 8. We still want to check this last number. And we still want to see if it's a perfect square number. 8 is not a perfect square number, so we're going to move it over to the other side because it's in our way. So we want to get rid of it. So now we have 3x squared plus 10x, leave a little space, equals 8. So far, so good. Haven't done anything new yet as opposed to the first two problems. So far, so good. Now, when you complete the square, we want this coefficient to be 1. So we need to divide all of these numbers by 3. If this number was a 4, we divide by 4. If it was 7, we divide by 7. So we do want this to be 1x squared, like problem number 1 and problem number 2. So we need to divide everything by 3. So we're going to divide this whole side by 3 and divide this whole side by 3. So now we have x squared plus 10 thirds x, leave a little space, equals 8 thirds. So we're getting a little messy here with our numbers and our fractions, but we are still doing everything correctly. So we divided the whole thing by 3 so that my leading coefficient would be 1. And it's okay to have improper fractions. Hopefully by now you're comfortable working with those. Nothing wrong with having a fraction. Now from here, we are going to complete the square just like we did in the previous problems. Off to the side, I encourage you to list out your step 1 and list out your step 2. So step 1, take half of the middle number. So take half of the middle number. Definitely you can use a calculator. 10 thirds divided by 2 is going to give us 5 thirds. I was jumping ahead there. I already knew what it was. So 10 thirds divided by 2 is 5 thirds. Feel free to type that in the calculator. It'll give you 5 thirds. Now we need to square 5 thirds. So 5 thirds times 5 thirds. Again, use that calculator, use Desmos. There's nothing wrong with that. It's going to give you 25 ninths. So 25 ninths is what we're adding here, and it's what we're adding here. So plus 25 ninths plus 25 ninths, because we got to keep our equation balanced. So yes, it is messier than the other problems that we did because we have these crazy improper fractions that we got to keep carrying throughout, but that's okay. Same pattern is there, okay? Take half of the middle number and then square it. Now I need to factor this. 2 numbers that multiply to give me 25 ninths, add to give me 10 thirds. So 2 numbers that multiply to give us 25 ninths and add to give me 10 thirds. So we know that something times something has to give me x squared, so that's x. Now, the reason I like for you to write out your step 1 and step 2 is because the number that goes in parentheses will always be this first number 1 over here. So the number that goes in parentheses is 5 thirds. So 5 thirds times 5 thirds gives us 25 ninths. 5 thirds plus 5 thirds gives me 10 thirds. So again, the reason I like for you to write out your steps over here to the side is because when you get to the factoring part, whether it's a fraction or not, it will always be step number 1 that goes into the parentheses to give you the perfect square number. If I compare that back up here to the first ones that we did, notice number 1, 2, and 2 popped up when we factored it. If I go back all the way to number 1, Notice -5, -5, and -5. So if you write out your steps, the factoring will come a little easier because it'll always be number 1 over here. We can use our calculator to type this in. 8/3 plus 25/9 gives me 49/9. Again, calculator is our friend. There's no need to try to do these in your head. You can if you want to, but we got a calculator to help us. Let's go ahead and condense this, make it smaller. Squared equals 49/9. Opposite of squaring something is to take the square root. So this gives me x plus 5/3 equals plus or minus, type this in the calculator, Desmos, type it in, it'll give you 7/3. So x plus 5/3 equals plus or minus 7/3. X plus 5/3 equals plus or minus 7/3. So this problem was longer because we had the improper fractions and we had to divide by the first number in the problem. So almost done. Down here at the bottom, I need to set up my 2 different equations. So x plus 5/3 equals 7/3. And x plus 5/3 gives me -7/3. So I took this equation, x plus 5/3 equals positive 7/3. X plus 5/3 equals -7/3. So I set it equal to the positive and the negative. We use our calculator, subtract 5/3 from both sides. On this side, we get 2/3. Subtract 5/3 from both sides. On this side, we get -4. So this is my answer, and this is my answer. All right, I think this problem definitely deserves a little recap before you go try today's assignment. This was not a perfect square number, so we got rid of it. We moved it to the other side. So we added 8 to both sides because it's the opposite of a -8. We divided everything by 3 because we want our leading coefficient to be 1. If this number was 5, divide by 5. If it was 100, divide by 100. If it was 2,000, divide by 2,000. We completed the square. Take half of 10/3 and take half of 10/3 and square it. Add that number to both sides to keep our equation balanced. And then from here, we were just solving the equation. So number 3 is like number 1 and 2, but it was longer because we had improper fractions. So 2 important take-home points, and then I'll be quiet because I know today's video is a little longer. Please write out your step 1 and step 2 because that'll help you when you factor. Step 1 will always be what goes into your parentheses if it's a perfect square, if we're trying to get the perfect square number. So when you're completing the square, this step 1 is always what goes over there. So just a little hint to help you out if you're not good at factoring, and definitely when you get down to like problem number 3 down here at the bottom, when you get down to doing the fractions. And the other take-home point that I want you to know, whatever number you add into both sides should be positive. Number 1 was positive. Number 2 was positive. Number 3 was positive. They should always be positive because a positive times a positive is a positive, and a negative times a negative is a positive. So this number, this C value that you add in should always, always be a positive number. All right, now you're all good and ready to go finish up today's assignment.